watch this late. Right, let me just get the presentation ready. Right, okay. I think we're in a good place now. Get this onto the right slide. Okay, good morning, guys. Can you just give me all a bit of a thumbs up and just check that you can see the slides? Awesome, awesome, that's great. If you can't hear me or the sound goes down, just do give me a shout or just ping me in Slack. So today, this is class 3 of the UX track. We're going to be talking today about synthesis, this kind of notion of define and modeling the information that we have collected. So I'll just take you through a little agenda here. So we're going to talk through analysis and synthesis and the difference between the two. We're then going to look at affinity diagrams, what they are, why we use them, and how to use them. And then we're going to look into some of the models that we use, things like personas and customer journey maps. And we'll go into a little bit of discussion and detail around some of the examples there. Some of you may be familiar with them. You may have come across them in phase 1. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more detailed discussion around what makes a good journey map and a good persona and a bad one as well. And then we'll go on to the assignments and critique, just a reminder of what work is upcoming. And then if you want to open up for questions. And then at the end, we'll go into the critique. We'll have a short break for about 10 minutes. And then we'll go into the critique and we will talk about some of the work you've got ongoing, which I believe is the user interviews and the SME interviews, expert interviews, and the contextual inquiries. So we can talk through some of that material. So we're now moving into the kind of second part of these weekly concepts. The first concept was really about gathering information. If we go back to that double diamond diagram, you may remember the 2 diamonds. The first concept, this process, research, strategy, is all about opening up the brief and gathering as much information as possible. And now we're moving into the synthesis and modeling phase where we've got all this information and we've got a lot of it and we're not quite sure what to do with it. There's a lot there. So this is all about making sense of it and trying to find out methods and ways of handling that data that gives us some nice things to work from, some actionable points of reference to work from. And the other thing I should probably say about this is it's very much about team working. So the synthesis and modeling that you come up with is all about working together as a team and trying to form and agree some of those principles and some of those things that you will move forward into the kind of information architecture and wireframing stages, etc. So let's talk a little bit about analysis and synthesis in the design process. The two are subtly different, and it's quite important just to kind of make sure you understand the difference between the two. They each play a different role, but the difference is quite subtle, so it's worth kind of going through this. So the goal of analysis is to take that large concept and break it down into smaller, simpler ideas. So you start to see this when you're getting your transcripts or your user interviews and you're breaking it down into summaries. You're not adding any more information. You're simply breaking it down into what are quite pithy bullet points or things that kind of make sense to a larger audience. And by that, what you're doing is you're making it more manageable. You're making it more understandable to the rest of the team. And a good kind of check on that is so that you can check it with each other. You can say, do you understand this post-it note, or do you understand this bullet point? Because otherwise you expect people to look at the whole transcript, or to read the whole video, or watch the whole video, or to listen to the whole audio clip. And of course, no one's got the time for that. So this sense of analysis and breaking it down into small things is really important, because it gives you a really good point to start from in terms of your team working. So the goal of synthesis is a little bit different, and this is a quote from Adam Hillman. Data must go through a transformation process in order to become information or knowledge. Manipulating, organizing, pruning, and filtering data helps us arrive at insights that drive the solutionizing process. So there's an additional bit that you have to do to try and derive the links from this information you've got and understand some of the patterns you've got going on. And that's not simply about understanding what you've got, it's about moving it forward into the next step. And some of the affinity mapping we will talk about later, it really does help you with forming some of this, this transformation. The other thing to bear in mind is synthesis is often undervalued in organizations. Excuse me. The temptation in a lot of companies and organizations is to immediately knee-jerk into a solution. So they will see, hey, the user is doing this behavior, or we noticed that there's a problem here, and they will immediately go to a solution. And what we're trying to do with both analysis and the synthesis phase is to break that down a little bit more, give it a little bit more time to digest it and understand what's really going on, and then draw more links, and also involve more people. Because the more perspectives you have coming into this idea of synthesis, the better ideas you have, and the more you are able to come up with, which is something more meaningful to everyone. So if you're all working on it together, you all have a shared sense of purpose, but also it's a bit more rigorous because you've all thought about it together. You've checked and counterbalanced some of those thoughts and feelings about some of the data you've got, and you're drawing some conclusions. Now, there are organizations, and especially financial services, and there are many other industries as well, who are very data driven, but they stop at they don't synthesize that data anymore. They literally look at the raw data and jump to these knee-jerk responses. So this sense of drawing these conclusions from the data and having a bit more time to process it and figure out what the links are can help you come out with completely different outcomes. So this is a diagram from, I believe it is, let me just check this. Yeah, so it's John Coco's diagram here on the 3 chasms. And this basically talks about how you go through data and how you sift and filter it and how you draw links. The first chasm is all about making meaning out of the data. So this is all about the understanding phase, making it simple, making it understandable to a wider target audience, making sure the whole team's aware of what that sentiment is. And this is where you start to use affinity mapping and flow diagram to start to bring this all out. And then chasm 2 is where you start to figure out where it maps into the experience and what the outcome is for the user. And chasm 3 is where you really start to pin down the empathy and the insights around the information you've got. So you're drawing out the wisdom around all this information you've collected, you've drawn the links, and you understand the empathy behind the problem. Now, going back to the double diamond, this is a more complex version of it than the one I showed you in the last class last week. When we were talking about this kind of research phase, we were talking about this this first opening up of the diamond. And that's where you are in a divergent mode. You are open to information. You are gathering that information. You are not prejudging anything. You are just taking on all this information. And now we're in this synthesis phase. And this is where you are converging. You are looking at everything you've got. You're not gathering any more information. You are literally trying to figure out what it is you've got and how you can draw links between it and understand the empathy, the other side of it from the users, going back to those three chasms. And I think we mentioned this before in the last class, but this sense of abductive reasoning, and this is what you're doing with abductive reasoning is you are trying to understand the inferences behind the data you've got. You're trying to draw those links. So if you think about Sherlock Holmes, he will look at the evidence. He will try and find the things that are factually correct, that are undisputable, and he will try and draw hypotheses to figure out the links between those items and then come up with a conclusion of who caused that crime. We're doing a similar thing, but we're not obviously trying to solve a crime. What we are trying to do is try to understand the empathy and the behaviors of those users, why they are in those scenarios, and why these factual things are happening, and draw some conclusions. So this is that sense of abductive reasoning and drawing inferences between that information. So we're going to go into talking about interpreting interviews data. Now, often when you get your interview data, it'd be quite overwhelming. If you have transcribed transcripts or you have reams and reams of video, it can be quite overwhelming. So you go into this sense of analysis, you start to simplify it, make it more understandable, and then you start to try and understand the patterns. Now, doing this in isolation is fraught with problems because you're only getting one perspective on it. So this is very much a team game, and you need to share, be able to in a position where you can share that information with each other. Hold that team meeting, walk through each interview in turn, and ask questions. So you need to be able to challenge some of the interpretations you might be giving. If you thought that maybe some of the question was leading and that gives a particular outcome from the user, you want to challenge that and you want to make sure. And if you agree that it was leading, then you can discount that information. Or if you believe that it is valid and it holds up, then maybe it's the start of a pattern. So it says try to recall details you don't know you remember, and bring multiple perspectives in the team. So this sense of bringing the team together and working through it. What I used to do when we were doing debriefs from interviews, we did a number of things. So one thing would be you take in turn. So you put down a lot of your summaries onto Post-it notes, and you try and make those as understandable as you can. So no two-word kind of entries, but you want at least a sentence there to describe what you're trying to portray from what you've observed in the testing sessions. And then you want to present that to the team. You want to say, hey, this is my first Post-it note. Let me explain what this means and how I saw this happen. And then you put it on the wall. And you go through every card in turn. And then when you've got through all of your cards, you sit down and the next person gets up and does the same. And what you're doing there is you're getting an understanding of each other's perspectives and each other's insights. And you're also trying to make sure that what you've written on the Post-it note actually communicates well with the team. That's really critical, because unless you know what is in everyone else's minds, you're not able to kind of come together and synthesize that information. Often what can happen is if you are facilitating different tests and you are looking after different participants, you will get completely different analysis and different thoughts coming around in your head. So you do need that process of bringing it all together. Especially in the past, what we've done is, and this is probably a mistake you don't want to make, if you are trying to get a broad range of demographics, and then you say, well, how about this facilitator takes on the younger demographic and this facilitator takes on the older demographic, you're probably going to end up with very different feedback. So this sense of bringing it back together is crucially important, to share and pool that knowledge and bring it back together. The other thing I was going to say was, what was it I was going to say? I'll probably come back to this. Don't know if you've got anything, Christina, you want to chip in about user testing debriefs.
don't
worry.
Sorry,
That's all right.
I can't really talk today.
No, that's fine. It's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I'll come back to this. There's a few things I was going to pass on about this, but ultimately, doing it in isolation is not going to work. You do need to work as a team. It's very much a kind of missionary kind of process, and bringing that back together is very important. So the interpretation session is an intensive, formal version of an interview debrief, and so you're going to do one of three things. You're going to review, as I mentioned. You're going to go through each person's interviews. And you're going to try and bring out some of that information. You're going to record each piece of a greater whole and should contribute positively to the system at the scale. There should be no isolated features or outliers. And then design each piece is a greater whole and should contribute positively to the system at scale. There should be no isolated features or outliers. Now, actually, I just remembered the other bit I was going to talk to you about. If there were two of you in a testing session with a participant, quite a good thing to do, and this doesn't happen very often because you don't often have more than one person running the sessions, but what you can do is each of you write your own notes, and then you can cross-reference. You can just double check them that they match up. So you're going through every question in turn, 1, 2, 3, and then you will come up with the things that you saw, the things you observed, and then you'll cross-reference with the other facilitator or the note taker and just check, yes, I agree that happened or not. And that's a really good way of just getting clarity on that information and making sure that it is rigorous and what you saw was actually correct. But when you've done, often we will do 6 users in one day, sometimes more, sometimes less, but generally it's about 6 users in a day. If you're spending an hour, maybe an hour and a half with each of those users, you're going through a hell of a lot of information. You're going through a lot of observations. You're going to forget stuff, and it happens to everybody. And sometimes you'll mix up the interviews, especially if you haven't written it down. You might mix up some of the information to different people, and so that's when it's important to come back to the group and say, "Did you see the same thing? And can I just check that you saw the same thing from the same person?" This can really help just give a little bit more validity to what you're saying and make sure when you come to those personas a little bit later and you start drawing up these typical users, you are deriving the right kind of personas, that you're not mistaking that for an older demographic or a younger demographic, etc. So this is a bit of a discussion between all of us, really. So discussion problem. So I want to understand from you guys why and how should we embrace our bias when we are talking about the feedback from interviews? I'll put this out there to anyone who wants to answer that.
Because if we're embracing our bias, we already have an understanding of our subjective position that we're taking when we're interviewing in order to be able to also counterbalance it in some way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think sometimes it's a bias. It can be a pro and a con. If you have a bias, sometimes you may be acting on something you instinctively have seen, but you haven't actually observed, which is tricky because we really should be looking at what we've observed, not what our instinct is at this stage. But sometimes when you say, "Oh, I thought this was happening," you might go around the team and they say, "Actually, no, I saw that happening with another participant." That often happens. That often happens within the testing. And sometimes we do also need to be mindful of our bias as well. That we might think, "Oh, that participant was just like my aunt and she would do it like this." But sometimes we can step too far and think your aunt is that person. And that can be dangerous as well. So we've got to be careful not to stereotype the participants, be really clear about the observations and the things that we observed. Those things are the truths, the factual evidence. But the embracing of the bias is important. You should use the instinct to kind of trigger some questions with the other people in the group. Any other thoughts from you guys about? Do you have any experience of bias in some of your transcripts and summaries of your user interviews when you were doing it recently?
I guess like some of my users were a bit older. I mean, we focused quite a bit on tech literacy. And I suppose in initial selection bias, you know, the poor unsuspecting individuals that they were, kind of picked them based on that sort of, on those grounds to an extent, which in itself is a bias. You know, immediately that kind of stereotype of, oh, they're older, so therefore they must be less tech savvy, intrinsically, and you know, it wasn't necessarily the case, but yeah, I would say that's perhaps an example.
Yeah, I think, I don't know whether this was something you guys did, but often what we do with a user testing session is you would provide a screener to a recruitment agency, and that screener typifies exactly what you're looking for. And this goes back to some of the problems you're facing. So from the research, that will derive a screener. You're looking for these users because you think there's this, and you're looking for this breakdown in demographics. So often it's a mix between new customers, old customers, and people who aren't customers if you're selling a product. But you might want to mix up in different ways depending on what you're trying to achieve from the research. But yeah, I think there's definitely a scenario where you will find out more about your users as you go through these interviews. And I think I've noticed the same thing when you are working with the older demographic. You presume in the back of your head that maybe they're not that tech savvy, but I've seen in my time lots of what they call silver surfers whizzing around on tablets and iPhones faster than, you know, the younger people. They've got a lot more time to kind of focus on these things. So I think, you know, this thing of demographics is can be a little bit misguided, but as long as you know why you're using demographic, that there can be validity to it. So the second point on here is about reframing and how perspective shifts the data, how it changes your perspective on it. And then this sense of how the environment and this perspective and the embodiment of that data, how that changes. Does anyone have any experiences of how the perspective dramatically changed as they were working through the information? Hi, Sim.
Hiya. The first thing is demographic versus target audience. What would be of more? I don't want to call it importance, but what would be of a higher value for the exercise? Is it better that we focus on demographic, which almost comes across like as an age question, as opposed to target audience? Because so my perspective basically in terms of reframing has been, I'd rather have the target audience, i.e. users that have these characteristics regardless of age, because then the need and the demand is the same, as opposed to here's a bunch of 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, which is kind of my interpretation of it.
Yeah, so where I've worked in the past at brands where, so for example, I used to work at BBC News, that covers all demographics. And the BBC has a policy and a mission to make sure they are encompassing all demographics. So there's a good reason to split up the demographic equally. Now, with the libraries, I think some of your insight on the libraries will play into this in terms of, do you think there is a need to attract a different demographic? Do you realistically believe that demographic can be attracted? Mm-hmm. And so those sorts of questions will derive in your research what is the right thing to do. But you may find that you only find out during the interviews.
Yeah.
There have been times in the past where I have had a screener for my candidates, and I've realised that actually a part of that screener was incorrect. My assumptions were incorrect about the audience, and that's fine because you are actually learning something. You're learning something quicker. But if you can, you want to top that up with some new users. You want to try and get them in as soon as possible and replace that demographic, or change them to the right people. Otherwise, you're missing out on the value. So, in answer to your question, obviously, target audience will be from your problem statement in terms of the information you've got. So, I mean, I can't answer that for you, but I think that's something you can kind of work on and figure out with the team on what you think that target audience is. Now, some of the initial interviews you've had, you might have had with the expert interviews, you might have had an insight from that from the people who operate the libraries, and that could be hugely powerful. Then when you drill down, you go into the kind of the more contextual inquiries of the people using the services, etc. Okay. You're probably going to get you're going to validate some of that thinking around, okay, this is a younger demographic. Are they going to come back? How frequently do they come here? You can start to ask those questions.
Sure.
And understand what is a valid thing for you to do with this brief. So it sounds like a bit of a cop out, but really it is informed by the research you're doing.
Yeah, no, I think you did really well there, Graham. No, cheers for that. That's insightful. So the core takeaways really for myself is that it's okay to go completely off piste with introducing demographics, essentially, right? And obviously to take the lean in from the SMEs as well, right?
I think if you're having a demographic split, you should have a reason for doing that.
Okay.
Now,
yeah.
So there should be something in the research, maybe the SME interviews, that maybe they tell you that, I know, all of our users in the library, all the people who attend the library are of this age. Okay. But you might say, actually, that's not our target audience. You might say, we want to twist this slightly differently. Okay. It really is down to what you feel is the problem and how you want to tackle it, which only you and the team can work through.
It's got to be a team thing. Okay. All right. Cheers for that, mate. Not
a problem. So let's go on to this last point. Explain the blind men and the elephant. What are the leading causes of this? So what this means to me is there are often, when you work in organizations, you're not going to go through this when you're working your teams right now, because you all have the same goals, you're all on the same course. But when you go into the industry and you start working with a client or with a stakeholder in a business, often there are unsaid goals within the business. And all these different teams will have their own KPIs, their own measurements, and that can be in conflict with what you're attempting to do. And some of those goals are unsaid. They're just assumed that everyone knows. So this is where your expert interviews are really valuable, because you can start to speak to even the people in your own team, right? Or even the stakeholders or the people you have dotted lines to in an organization. You can start to say, well, we're working on this. What's your thought around this and the direction of the business? And that's where you start to understand how they've been tasked to do something and how that differs from what you're trying to do. And I can't stress this enough. Although, part of what I'm helping to arm you with is this sense of how you can bring UX thinking and design thinking to an organization. It's also really important when you go into an organization to understand how they operate and how they manage themselves. Because if you don't do that and you don't get a good understanding of your host and their environment, it can cause you conflict later on. And if you haven't spoken to the right people through the SME interviews, that's where it can start to kind of unwind a little bit. Any thoughts on that? Anyone had any experiences of that whilst they've been working on this?
I do have a question, particularly SMEs. I understand that obviously they kind of have their own contextual experience because they're viewing people day in, day out in their environment. But what I found was that my SME only personally had experiences with the people that she interacted with. But there were a lot of people outside of that,
Yep.
which then fell into my user interviews, which were a younger audience ranging between the age of 20 and 30. And they didn't interact with anyone at the library because they know what they wanted to do there.
Got it. They didn't need much help. Yep.
So there's that whole other audience that I had no information about from the SME.
Got it. And when did you find out? When did we have that kind of epiphany moment where you realised that was the case?
I mean, it was fairly recently. I mean, an epiphany moment I had was young people could potentially use this product, because we'd kind of more focused on older people using the product, but young people could use the product, but they're not using it because there are better resources out there online at the moment. And the only reason they really use the library is because it's a quiet space to work. But which raises the question, could we create something, a resource from the library that they'd be interested in using?
Yeah, it sounds like they're effectively using it like a free WeWork.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, that insight is really valuable. I wonder now, if you were to go back to that SME and reflect on that information, would they recognise that? And would they might build on it in a little bit more information? So it'd be probably an interesting kind of perspective on that, to kind of go back and find out if there's any more information on that. But I think, those are exactly the kind of things that you should be observing and picking up on. Yeah, sounds great. Excuse me. So we're going to talk now about affinity diagrams. So the goal of affinity diagrams is to help turn research into evidence-based recommendations. You're trying to find patterns and useful insights from data points gathered through observations and interviews. Bring all the issues and opportunities into one place. Shows you a key element of users' lives relevant to the project focus, and a quick way to organize a lot of unstructured data. So, as with the kind of the debrief, exactly the same kind of scenario. You're working with the team, you're going through the transcripts and the notes, putting them on sticky notes, and you're starting to kind of introduce those topics to each other and make sure they're understandable, and you put them on the wall and you start to kind of bring them together. So there's some tips here for writing good sticky notes. And I think I've been guilty in the past. Often you get a very thick marker, you write a couple of words on a post-it note because it's in the front of your mind. You're thinking, I've got to get this down on paper really quickly before I forget it. So you have a bit of brevity in the way that you write that phrase. But of course, that doesn't always communicate that well. So by all means, put that down on a bit of paper. But then maybe before you stick it on the wall, or before you introduce it to everyone else, have a think about some of these tips here, and they'll help you to form good, meaningful sticky notes. So here's an example here, and what they've done here, these are direct quotes from the user. So there are different types of information, and it's important to recognize what they are and make sure they are represented in these post-it notes. So for example, these are direct quotes, so you see the quote marks on them. And what they've done here is they've given a reference to the transcript, so you can see where it's referenced in that document. And then if you're doing this on video, sometimes you've got a time code. So sometimes they put time codes in these things to kind of, so you can review back to the video at a later date. If you need to prove this to a stakeholder, you can go back and show them that clip and create a little montage of users saying what you've said. So it's a good way of kind of going back to the source information and proving it back to the stakeholder. This is an example, some examples of direct observations. So these are things you've actually observed happening. These are actions that are factually correct, but they may have been unverbal. They didn't actually say anything. And these are gold dust. And I think it comes a little bit with experience in what to look for. But often you will get users being quite emotive about a topic. And especially during user testing, even though they're emotive, they can complete the task. They can find the button, they can click on it. But the interesting thing is when you see them doing something which seems quite emotive, the good thing to do is kind of probe and find, oh, sounds like you are X, and what are you looking for, or what's on your mind. You can start to get a little bit more information, layer up that information based on the action. So direct observations, they are normally just sentences, and so they're very literal, and so you can present these to the rest of the team as exactly that. This is what I observed. And then there's stated goals. So these are expressly verbalized comments from the users. They said something like, I like to start the weekend with some good activities in mind. That is a goal. And it's a pretty obvious opening goal for what they are about to embark on, or what they're about to talk about. A similar one there is, I want my kids to keep learning even when they're not in school. So there's some really clear high-level goals there, which they may not have understood that's what they were doing, but it's our duty to try and make sure they are put down and transcribed and then put up in front of everybody, because these frame a lot of our judgment on all of the rest of the information. And then there's also implicit goals. Now, these are often things that they say, but they infer something else. So here's an example here. I always follow the same path through the grocery store. So it feels like they are trying to be as efficient as possible by going in the same route, because maybe they get a bit lost in the grocery store. So they're using this sense of habitual nature to speed things up. So that is an implicit goal. Another one here is, I always keep my devices charged to 100%. And that gives a sense of, well, maybe they don't know what's coming up in their day. Maybe they're going to be traveling for long periods, or maybe they're going to be without a PowerPoint for a long portion of their day. So these are quite difficult things to pick up on, and often when you're transcribing, you may only see these things on reflection. So you're probably not going to come up with these when you're in the sessions transcribing these notes, but you're probably on reflection going to think, oh, I wonder if they meant this. And another way of doing this is, you may not quite know what this implicit goal is, but sometimes you could share it with the rest of the team and say, they said this, it feels significant, but I'm not sure what it is. And that's a good way of saying, I'm getting a bit of a collective gathering of perspective on this, and try and understand what it is that might be the underlying goal behind this. So once we've got all of these cards, we're going to get into a point where we are going to start sharing them with each other, introducing them, making sure we all understand them, and then we're going to start grouping them. And this is where we are starting to draw out patterns. We're trying to understand where there are things that are happening more than once. And remember, we are dealing with qual information generally. So we're not talking about 60 matches. We're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenarios where this happens. But because we're deep diving into users and their feedback, this sense of drawing out patterns can be really useful for us to understand what is really going on. So there are 2 variations of this method. As you group notes, talk about the words on the notes, what the notes mean as it relates to the design focus of the team. This is helpful for establishing shared understanding and dealing with the contrasting points of view. So again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, I think it's a great idea, and it does take a bit of time, but going through each card individually, presenting it to the team, making sure they all understand what you've written. What you're also doing is you're also helping you to find duplicates. I'd say, oh, there are 3 of us in this room. We've all said the same thing, and we can all place the card immediately in the same group. So that helps you to kind of understand what each other has observed very quickly. You can also group entirely in silence to avoid cross-designer idea contamination and grouping alone before combining the results. So where this can be useful, I'm trying to think of a scenario where this could be useful, if you have very diverse audience and they have very different needs, so maybe you have a product you're selling which has a consumable version, and then it has a B2B version where they are expert users, they're power users, and they don't like to be patronized, and they just want to do what they normally do very quickly. Very different user cases. So what you might do is you might separate the analysis of those things and work through the cards in isolation, because they are so different, and see them as separate lots of affinity maps. But later you can start to draw conclusions as a group. You can start to say, well, there's some similarities between the novice user and the power user. And you can start to draw some similarities, and where you can start to see scenarios where you could create a product that could meet both needs. So sometimes you're going to notice things which this is difficult to verbalize, but you're going to collect things which seem significant at the time, and you're not quite sure what it is about that is significant. So in this scenario, you've got two cards. You could go multiple different ways here. So the thing that is mutually true on both these cards is that they are both talking about location and things being nearby. So you could group these together and say this is about the user's need for things being nearby and the need to know about these services being nearby. So there's a clear kind of theme there. But equally, you could also say, well, this user likes to browse by icons, and this user likes to find by a map. Or you might say this user is interested in gas stations, or this user is interested in restaurants. So you can see how you group these things. It can be on one level quite surface, and it can be quite deeper in others. So try, if you can, to focus on the behavioral aspects of the user rather than the kind of the surface words that you see on the post-it notes. So labeling groups. So affinity relationship is subjective and requires interpretation. By creating labels for groups of notes, you are creating new information to inform the design process. So you are bringing together all these post-it notes. You're seeing there's some similarities in either the user intent or the observations that you saw. And what you're going to do now is you're going to start to label those groups. Now, there's some subtleties in this, because if you just label them with a one-word answer and say this is the theme of users wanting things nearby, that may not be enough. That may not be an underlying intent for you to work with. So I think there's some slides here on how to do this. So labeling guidelines for affinity diagrams. So try and wait as long as possible before you start labeling. The danger is that if you label too early, you start trying to find out where you can fit the remaining post-it notes into those groups. So you're kind of forcing your hand into grouping things in the groups you've predefined. Whereas if you leave it as long as possible, you'll find a natural order for all of those post-it notes. You'll find things that are meaningful and have a clear theme. And then you'll be able to derive what that group and that label is later. Keep the labels simple and direct as you can. It can be helpful to write labels from the user's point of view, like they are talking to the design team. So rather than saying users like nearby, for example, you might put nearby on those group of notes we saw earlier. You might say, I like to find my services nearby. Make it also more sort of user-facing, a bit more understandable from a user's perspective. That also helps when you speak to your stakeholders, that you're really talking from a different perspective, because they will tell you quite literally, oh, users like nearby data, but you could talk from the user's voice. You have that authority because you're using the information you have used from the interviews. Limiting groups. So if you have a group has more done 7 or 8 notes. Try and break those apart. So you may end up with, I don't know, 20 cards that are similar. But then when you look into it in a little bit more detail, you might think, oh no, these are slightly different. As we were saying before about the intent, so you might come up with the surface things, that the key words on the Post-it note are the same, which is one level of grouping. But the next level is, how does the intent differ? So in the example we saw earlier, nearby may be very different when you're looking for a gas station to a restaurant, because when you're looking for a gas station, you're in your car. So maybe you can talk about being nearby in your car, and then different controls on the app or whatever it is. With a restaurant, it's more about planning ahead. So a very different kind of user case. So nearby and planning. So that's a good thing to do. Try and break them down as much as possible, and try and use all different perspectives in your group. Really make sure that everyone has spoken, and try and gather any kind of perspective that may be missing from those groups. So just some examples then of how we group labels. So this one, this is how this is more categorized than insightful. How I choose recommendations. It doesn't give you a hell of a lot of background, whereas the second example is a little bit more insightful of the user's intent. I don't choose a destination until I've checked out available accommodations. So you're getting a little bit more. Whereas if you went back to the first Post-it note after 3 days, I guarantee you will have lost that valuable bit of intent and that behavioral aspect, and it will be very difficult to move forwards from that observation. So there is you can somehow try and sorry, excuse me 1 second. The insight on these cards sometimes is often suggested by the group, and really you're trying to find a label which fits all the range of options there. So we've got some cards here. She likes that Google gives you local listings for restaurants and stores nearby. She likes using a built-in Zagat feature in his car to find good restaurants in his area. He uses the icon feature of the map in his car to help him find gas stations nearby. If you were to label it under that title, different ways of finding things, that can help you. That may not help you to understand what it is that you're going to take forward into the prototyping phases, and understand how you're going to tackle that problem or that issue. Whereas if you were to say something like, I don't know, so you start to see how you can use, try and agree with the team how you can group those labels that is meaningful to you all, so you all understand what that thing is. So, excuse me. So with this one, you would not have to review any of the notes below to learn anything. I think sometimes you need to have labels which make you want to go back to some of the reference material and check that the assumption you have from that labeling is correct. So instead you can turn it to, I love getting local results immediately without having to ask. And this is a good example. The key principle in holding notes together, this distinction is important for the design, and they're examples of a general statement. And here's an example of an affinity diagram. You can see right at the top, you've got this sense of the main user goal. We plan our trip together. And then you've got this breakdown of these different elements of that. We share the job of researching where we go. So you start to see it involves multiple users. We plan the trip as a group. I take responsibility for booking or just part of the trip. So you can start to see then very clearly, you've got a team dynamic in booking something where the roles differ. and you're starting to identify from the observations you've got, and you can see some of the cards underneath, how that is backed up with the evidence you've got. Cool, so we'll briefly talk about user models. The goal of models is to serve as documentation of what everyone understands through synthesis. So what you are attempting to do is bring together all this information in a diagrammatic format that is very easy to understand, that is very accessible. The act of building models through conversation, organization, and clarification makes them thinking tools. The act of sharing models through collaboration, documentation, and shared practice makes them communication tools. I won't go into too much depth on this because we are running out of time, but user modeling discussion, we would talk through what is a user's mental model. A user's mental model is generally how they think of a topic. And so, for example, if they were to use some scissors, they would have a mental model of what scissors look like, where they put their hands and how they use scissors. That's what they expect in their mental model. That's what they've built up scissors and how they cut bits of paper. And what tools do we have for modeling user behaviors? So there's multiple ways that we can model these behaviors. One second, I'm sorry, I just lost the screen. And what is the difference between a user profile, proto-persona, and a persona? So a user profile is generally used in development teams when they, for example, have a feature where there are multiple different users with different access privileges. So in Canvas, there are access privileges for you as students and different roles for teaching assistants or teachers. And that's a very literal way of thinking about features and functionality. A proto-persona, it generally derives from Lean UX. So it's a very quick, sketchy persona. You'll normally do this on an A4 piece of paper. You fold it into 4 quadrants, and each quadrant tells you something different about the user. Normally you have basic demographics in one square. You talk about their needs and their goals, and they have a bit of background information about their life and what they do in their lifestyle. And the persona is more of a typical user. So this is where you start to use abductive reasoning to start to draw out from the information you've got these almost these caricatures of the users you've got from the evidence you have. So, for example, you may decide that the demographic split isn't quite right. You've got some intense some behaviors around library usage. So maybe you've got a frequent user of libraries, and you might label them as the frequent loaner of books. Or you might have someone who comes once every year and they've come to do one specific thing. So you might label them after that specific thing they do. And what you're trying to do is trying to characterize the intent and the need and the goals between your users around a scenario. There are some criticism of personas. So when they are very similar to what you might call marketing profiles. And marketing profiles will look at numbers, vast numbers of users and put them into big camps so they can target them for marketing means. So you might do direct mailing or you might do emailings. And the two can get quite confused. So personas can feel like you're stereotyping sometimes, and sometimes there can be a lot of noise, a lot of unimportant information on there. Whereas marketing audience profiling tends to be quite data driven. It's about significant numbers of users. We're dealing with qual information, so there's a lot less information, a lot less users, but we're hoping that information is going to stir us into some innovation later. Now, this thing about sometimes personas not having a lot of noise on them, sometimes that's important. So you may go through your development of the persona in your teams, and you may decide that actually this perhaps unimportant fact that maybe came out of a user session really brings it home and makes it familiar. You all understand this person, And so adding some of this information in there, which seems needless, helps you to remember it, and it becomes this kind of mental note as you're going on through the design process, where you recognize, oh, would that person use this? And you remember them really well because you characterize them so well. Yeah, and the other thing is about personas is there's some criticism around them becoming less important as your teams become more user-centered. So in the early stages of product development, maybe you don't have a product to start off with, so you're developing a new product. Personas can be really important to understand that target audience. But once you have that product and it's live and it's working, you will continually get feedback into that development team. And that sometimes supersedes the personas. Now, there's an argument for saying you should be updating the personas, but sometimes if you're in a fast-paced development team, that could feel like needless work because it's so fast-paced. You're getting such new information at such a rapid pace. Maybe you only need to benchmark it once a year or update them once a year. But that's some of the criticisms of personas. That they tend to be quite document heavy. There's quite a lot of work in there. They're perhaps less on the quant side, although you can add quant information in there if you want. Especially the work that we're doing is more based on low numbers, but you're trying to understand the behavioral aspects, the intent of the user, rather than the profiling of who they are. So we're going to personas. We're going to give some examples of some personas here. So here's some personas there where you can see this is Nick here, and they've labeled him as the casual user. So maybe his use is infrequent. Maybe he comes once every while to use this product or attend this library, whatever that service is. And you can see clearly here the goal of that persona is written there. So Nick's goal there is a cost-effective mode of transport that allows him to be spontaneous. And the combination of goals and motivations, they should kind of marry up. So here you see Natalie here, who is the hesitant prospect. So Natalie's motivations is Natalie's worried about safety on the road. She's keen to talk to a friend who's tried the scheme for reassurance, but her goals are to be able to trial the scheme in a safe environment, an alternative, safe way to commute to work. So you start to see how the motivations do kind of wrap up with the goals quite nicely. So you may not be able to solve every single goal for every one of your users. You're going to find, and this goes back to the example that Sim was talking about earlier, you may find there are particular behaviors you're seeing in the library that actually you don't think you can do much with. You probably know the operational aspects of the library. You probably picked up on some of that from your SME interviews. So you may deprioritize that persona and start to say, well, actually, this one here has more opportunities for us. This one we think has a gap that we can actually solve given what we understand about the business. Journey maps, I'll go through this briefly. Sorry, we're running slightly over time here, but journey maps is a way of understanding what the user needs to go through to solve that goal or that motivation. And what you see on here is mapped out on here is their emotional state. You see the events across the top there, where it says what they are, what's happening to them, and you're starting to see descriptions of each individual phase and what happens. So you're really trying to understand, get into the skin of the user and that persona, and try and understand what they need to be able to go through, what process they need to go through that fits in with their life and their motivations to solve that need or that goal. And there's some different examples, just to give you a few different, there are lots of different ways doing journey maps, by the way. This one is quite a classic way of doing it. This one is slightly different. You can see their use of icons there, and they're showing this on this kind of line diagram. There's some kind of iterative nature going on there, so there's some circular kind of processes. But effectively the same information, and you are trying to expand on what is happening at each point, both from a task-based point of view, but also from an emotive point of view from the user. And another example there. And you can see there, they've used icons quite a lot more. There's a lot less information there. There's a lot less words on there, but I think you'll have to gauge that with your stakeholders or your clients about whether you want it to be just accessible or whether it's a deep dive document where people need to read and absorb the information one by one. And this is just an example of the emotive side of the user. And so we've labeled here where they get frustrated, and hopefully in some of the, sorry, this is the aspiration. So you've got an aspirational line at the top and you've got the existing pain point. So what you're doing here is you're trying to map where the user gets frustrated and how you might solve that on the top line. You're trying to say, we know the user gets frustrated on this point, and this is how we will solve it. So you can start to kind of identify from a review of what's happening already and how you might respond to that with your proposed new feature. So that's it for the class. I'm just going to run through the upcoming assignments. So you have quite a few things going on at the moment. So you have the affinity diagrams, one focused on the persona construction, and one focused on the problem statements and design principles. That's due Thursday. You've got the user personas, 2 of those required, and you've got the journey map, one for the user journey without your solution, and one per persona. And then you've got the problem statement draft. So those are all due on Thursday. Do feel free to put in at least one one-to-one with either me or Christina every week, and more if you need it. Don't be afraid to. And if you want different perspectives, please feel free to use both me and Christina. We will help you with your assignments where we can. And then the critique, I believe, is on Friday. What we'd like to do in your teams is present some of this information back, so it will be submitted on the Thursday. And then we'd like to present some of this information back. So try and get it in some presentational software, something like Google Slides, and we'll start to go through your problem statement, your personas, and your journey maps. So we're going to, there's some additional resources on here, which I will send out these decks later to you, so you can look at those in your own time. We're going to pause now just for a quick 5-minute break. Sorry, we slightly overran there. And we'll come back for the critique, and we'll go through some of your work you've been doing on your SME expert interviews and your user interviews and contextual inquiries. It'd be great to hear some of the insights and challenges you've had and how you've overcome them. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in about 5 minutes.
about doing this task. And then, yeah, we can sort of chime in as a group and deliver to you the feedback we gain from the user interviews and also our contextual inquiries. So, brilliant. So you touched on it, Graham, there. As a group, we thought that after re-examining our SME interviews, it would make sense to get as broad a range of feedback as possible. So we chose to actually do user interviews for 4 people who are active users of library services and 4 non-users of library services. The only sort of key characteristic that was shared between all 8 interviewees was that they fitted or matched up with some of the audience criteria outlined in the previous task. We felt that the results gained using this method would be as valuable as possible. For all 8 users, we created an interview script. We had roughly 20 questions that we thought we should loosely follow to ensure that we're sort of all on the same path. Add as much value to the results that we gathered from the interviews. So firstly, we started off by doing sort of starter questions. These were designed to sort of, put the interviewer at ease, help set the scene, get some sort of generic information about them. Secondly, we were looking at a series of questions that sort of deep dived into their experiences with the library or lack thereof in the instance of people who didn't use library services. Thirdly, we looked at technical literacy. That was something that came up quite heavily in our SME interviews, so we thought it would make sense to understand in more detail, if people were tech literate, how did they become so? If not, what services were they using to sort of help them become so, if at all? Fourthly, language. Something that came up in our SME interviews was that people that were using the library services didn't have English as their first language. So where relevant, we asked people, if that was a hindrance to them using the library services and what services they were using to help them become better at speaking English. Fifthly, the library is a sort of community hub. That's another thing that came up quite heavily in our SME interviews. So we wanted to ask questions that helped us to understand, if people were using the library as a community hub, if they saw it as a community hub, why was this the case? And if not, what was stopping them from, using it for this reason? Finally, jobs. That was the last thing that came up. We wanted to understand, if people were using the library as a way to sort of gather career advice or, seek jobs. And if not, why not? What other services were they using? Finally, we had a wrap up, and then we had right at the end a magic wand question. So we asked them, if you had a magic wand and you could have one thing from this app that would really rock your world, what would that look like? That again gathered some interesting results.
Great.
Which we'll go over shortly. With regards to the contextual inquiry, we thought, we spent a long time looking at this as a group. We thought it would be challenging for us to, because we're in 4 different environments, the libraries, provide different services. We found it challenging to sort of, have one consistent thing that got information from 4 different people doing the same sets of tasks in 4 different environments. So what we decided was that we would all observe people using a library in a computer in a library environment. We'd watch them for as long as they let us without being creepy, and we'd see if there were any trends or similarities between the tasks that they were performing. We thought that would be the sort of most efficient way to do this. So what I'll do now, I'll bring up these general takeaways. These were sort of a general overall summary of the takeaways we gathered as a group. I'll leave this up on the screen for you to read. And what we'll do now is sort of go around the group and briefly explain our experiences and any sort of key takeaways that we gathered from each interview. So I'll begin. My first user was Olivia. She was 27, introduced via a friend of a friend of a friend. I sent out some notifications via WhatsApp and actually managed to gain an interview with a friend of a friend. It was my friend's sister. She hadn't been to the library since her uni days. She didn't feel that she didn't link the library to the provision of any services that she needed to access or use in her everyday life. And leading on from that, she felt that the library had a sort of stereotypical image, among people her age that led to them not using it as much. In terms of device usage, she used a phone and a tablet heavily on a daily basis. And I think that was something that was strongly felt by the rest of the group. She didn't have time to go to the library much. Sort of during the opening hours, they didn't work well with her current schedule. I.e., when the library was open, she was working, and at weekends she wanted to socialize and not be in the library. So, the amount of time the library was open was something that came up quite a lot. She feels that she would use the services more if they were available digitally through an app, or something similar to Kindle, as she grew up in a generation that was encouraged to do that as much as possible in terms of their technical proficiency. She'd use the library much more as a community hub if it provided access to activities she enjoyed. She does lots of yoga and meditation. If the library made an effort to provide these sorts of services, then she might be more inclined to look at using it outside of her normal schedule or routine. So that was Olivia. That was the person that didn't use the library. Secondly, my second interview was with Gloria. I found her in the library in the foyer. I had a sort of brief conversation with her, explained the nature of what I was doing. I think she felt sorry for me and agreed to let me interview her. So yeah, she's 59. She comes to the library mainly to use the computer services. She said that as a Wandsworth resident, you're entitled to 2 hours of use of library facilities or computers per day. So that's something she wanted to utilize. She again used the phone and tablet on a daily basis very, very heavily. She had a strong sense of belief that libraries should be community hubs where people can come together and learn technical skills, especially in this digital age. She's aware that libraries are underfunded and thinks that if we don't use them, we'll lose them. So she was very, very passionate about that. She came to the library to do things she could easily do at home, i.e. printing and using the internet and Wi-Fi, but she felt that it's a one-stop shop and she could focus more easily. You can go to a cafe and use Wi-Fi, you can go to a printing shop and do printing, but she liked to be able to come to the library and really get focused and do predetermined tasks that she'd set out for herself. She was a very heavy user, so she was using at least sort of once a week, mainly twice a week. She would use the library more, again, as a community hub if it fitted in more with her working hours, her working schedule. She liked the fact that there was staff on hand that could help if she encountered any technical difficulties whilst using the facilities. And with regards to the provision of training courses, she would use them if she knew that they were available, but she wasn't actually aware of any services that were available to her. But if they were promoted better by the library or the institution, she would actively use those. So yeah, that's an overall summary of my user interviews. I'll pass over to someone else in the group.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay.
All right.
Go ahead, mate.
All right, no problem. So my first interview was Rita. I was in hospital on Sunday, but that didn't stop me pestering people for interviews. And I found this lovely nurse who, in fact, was studying to upskill. So she was doing a university course 3 days a week. And she spent much of her time in her local library studying. So I wanted to understand at first how proficient she was with technology. She said she spent a lot of time on her computer, which essentially forced her to become much more IT literate. She did mention there were certain things that she didn't understand about her computer, but if she spent enough time, she could solve those problems herself. And if there really was a big problem, she would contact her daughter, who was 24 years old and very competent with IT. Main takeaways from her, I'd say that, again, with what Leon said, there's similarities in the sense that she saw the library as a community hub. It's something that she wanted the library to focus on more. She did see over the years that there was a decline in people going to libraries and a decline in people taking out books. And she realized that there was definitely a space to get the younger generation more involved. It was something that she did want to see, especially when we spoke about the magic wand option. She was very fixated on getting kind of teenagers and millennials to get more involved with the library, and especially when it came to work and education. So that was very interesting. I believe there was something quite important that she mentioned. See if I can find it. I won't worry about that. I'm sure it was something small, but my second interview, it was actually on the other end of the spectrum. Younger guy, 26. He was kind of in the stage of changing careers.
Yep.
He wanted to become a musician. He spent a lot of time in the library because he said he enjoyed the quiet space. It was easy for him to sit down, plug his headphones in, and start making music.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, he said he didn't really use any of the library resources because there wasn't really any resources that he couldn't find online already. He felt as well that they didn't really offer any resources that he really knew about, so maybe the signposting wasn't that great for him.
Mm-hmm.
He did suggest that in ways of improving things, he would really like to see an increase in the community. He mentioned that he used things such as Instagram and LinkedIn a lot as a way to communicate with other people and what's the word? Basically foster a sense of community and things that he was interested in.
Yep.
The library didn't really provide, and that's something that he was seeking. I did ask him if the library focused more on these community aspects, would he then use that service over other services that he currently uses? And he said yes, he would. So there's definitely scope there to build upon that. But yeah, that's it really.
That's great.
Natalia, do you want to go, or shall I jump in?
I can go next.
Cool.
So yeah, I interviewed Caspar and Fatima, who are they both working, but they want to change their career. So they are studying or looking for jobs in the library. Caspar is from Ealing, but he goes to the British Library, which is 45 minutes from his home. But he prefers going there because his local library is quite small and the internet doesn't go work properly. And Fatima is from Egypt, but she lives in Whitechapel, and she enjoys all sorts of services in the library because she likes assist to some events that the library is running. She also tried to get some job advices, but the library advice were like too general for her field, so she felt a bit frustrated with the advices they gave her. Yeah, they both like using the space of the library and internet if it works well. And yeah, basically, I mean that was yeah, that's maybe the thing that they like the most, the fact that they can use the space, also use the library as a community hub. Caspar, for example, likes going to the British Library because it's where his friends are as well, other than resources and everything. So yes, he likes doing this kind of community there. And also Fatima, that likes enjoying other services in the library, said that the only way she has to find out what's going on in the library is through leaflets in the reception instead of through digital channels. So that sometimes she miss some good information or some event that she might find interesting. Just because of that, it's true. Like they update it like not often as she wanted. Yeah. Kristen, you can go ahead.
Yep. Okay. My two were unsuspecting members of the public. One of them I met in a restaurant, which I know that sort of older people tend to frequent in Guildford, in the off chance that I'd meet a potential user who would kind of meet the kind of core demographic that we had sort of highlighted in the SME interviews. Instead, I actually got probably the most heavy duty library user that, all of us, had interviewed combined. I think, he was a daily user. But his goals were very, very simple. He just went there to go and use the internet for whatever it may be. So that was either to check his emails, to look at the weather, and simple tasks along those lines. He was 66, a retiree, but made redundant due to automation at his previous place of work, interestingly enough. Overall, he was not very comfortable using devices like smartphones or tablets, and recognized that he could do a lot more with training. And that was something we touched on, was what kind of training that would be. He was very kind of, he believed strongly that it would be face-to-face sort of things, and interactions with people potentially at the library to help him become better. Because he again viewed the library as an information hub, that's what he called it, and a sort of support network where people can go and access information whenever they want, without worrying about things like the internet. Because he didn't have the internet at home. Like, he didn't have a Chromebook at home. He had a smartphone, but he only knew how to use it to make calls and use it as a calculator. So he was kind of tech competent, but he wasn't tech literate, if you see what I mean. And he recognized that. He wasn't looking to re-enter the workforce or do any courses or upskill. And by his own admission, his sort of desires and goals going to a library were very, very simple and singular. It was to get his hands on information, access the internet, and maybe have a look for some events. He didn't really do a hell of a lot in terms of getting involved with events or other community things, so he wasn't particularly helpful on that front. But his sort of big issue that he thought, that sort of, when I asked him about, what would you be able to change, the magic wand question, it very much was about budget cuts and the fact that these libraries are far too underfunded. They're far too understaffed. They're decrepit. So for anybody, whether it's him or younger generations, to get involved in libraries, it's going to take more than an application in his mind. That it's going to take an overhaul of the library service in general. My second interview was with a woman called Helen Derwent, again, another unsuspecting member of the public who I preyed upon in a cafe. She was 52 and a speech therapist. She was, by contrast, very tech savvy. So she used iPads, iPhone, computer at work, etc., etc. So a lot of the questions about sort of tech literacy didn't really pertain to her at all. And so that kind of all fell by the wayside a bit, which was absolutely fine. So it gave us a kind of more holistic picture about what a potential user could be. She actually uses the library once a month, but her goal really was just to get out books. She'd go there with her daughter, and they would see if there are any events going on, because her local library actually annexed onto a community hub, which had a cafe. They then had Women's Institute or Women's Group meetings there every now and then, and they would attend, and they really, really enjoyed that. That was something that they got a lot of benefit from, which I thought was interesting as a form of kind of community. She also wasn't looking to upskill, change career, or do any training, and she basically would only really sort of want anything from the library in kind of book form. Like the events weren't of particular interest to her, and when I asked what kind of features would you want to see from this app, magic wand and all that kind of stuff, it was very, very simple. Like, she just wanted something that would tell her about books being renewed or when they needed to be taken back. She was great, but one of these ones who was monosyllabic in answering, which I thought was ironic for being a speech therapist. And yeah, it was like pulling hen's teeth, unfortunately. It really was a bit of an activity, trying to sort of navigate around response that she's given to kind of elaborate a little bit. But it was when we touched on questions about community and, things like that kind of really elicited a greater response. Anyway, that's me done.
Nice. Now moving on to sort of challenges and takeaways. So I'll start with challenges, and then we can discuss. This is a group. Feel free to jump in as and when you see fit. With regards to the user interviews, we felt that they were challenging, not as much so as the contextual inquiries. People outside of the library, we were sort of using our networks and going into non-library environments, so it was easier to sort of gather these interviews. Inside the library, slightly more challenging, but how did we get around that? We had a job to do, and we stuck at it until we all obtained the necessary number of interviews. Contextual inquiries, we observed people looking or sort of going about their daily lives on a computer device based within the library. Didn't really see that there were any patterns or trends or anything that linked the 4 different tasks that we observed people doing. As a result, we found it slightly, we were questioning the validity of the results that we obtained in the contextual inquiry.
I'll just jump in there, Leon, if that's all right. Sorry. Because I think we all noticed, and this was something that ran contrary to the SME interviews that we were doing, that a lot of people were getting on with what they were doing, and they were doing it very well. There was no real issue with it for a lot of people, and that was something that obviously ran contrary to what a lot of the SMEs said, that people weren't tech literate, they were coming looking for help. Sorry, I don't know if you're going to move on to that, but that was just something that.
I was exactly that. The next point we felt.
Sorry, mate.
Generally, there was a disconnect between, or sort of, a lot of differences between what the SMEs were telling us and the information we obtained from our users. So that's something to take into consideration when we're looking to sort of analyze and synthesize the results for the next task. Don't know if anyone else wants to add anything there.
Yeah, I'd have one thing to say. When it came down to the nurse I was interviewing, I didn't actually do a contextual research with her, but what I've sort of realized is that there were some aspects of contextual research in the sense that when we were talking, she sat down, and if she had a problem with her computer in the library, she said, she would look around, almost looking for help, and then she would try solve it herself, and then if she couldn't, she would call her daughter. So that helped break down how a potential user would solve certain difficulties, and can maybe help with us creating a solution for that. I don't know if that's the correct way to look at it. Graham, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I found from her.
Yeah, I mean, generally, I think we can conclude by saying that there weren't any apparent trends that we've noticed, but upon doing the next task, the affinity diagrams, I'm hoping that that allows us to see trends and things that patterns that exist between the data that we collected.
While I was in the sorry, this is sort of more ethnographic, I suppose. But while I was in the computer library computer room, even. I did witness one of these digital buddies who were people brought on or volunteers who come in 3 times a week to the local library where I went to, who basically their sole purpose is there to help with tech literacy. So whatever the questions may be. And I got a chance to chat with him, but what I witnessed while he was helping was exactly what they were talking about. He was helping a foreign older lady use and basically figure out the computer. And what was interesting is that was exactly what they were talking about, but it was an isolated case amongst a kind of sea of other people just getting on with their stuff. I mean, the guy who I kind of witnessed doing everything, he was, again, not exactly tech savvy per se, because he was a 60-year-old machinist, again, who, by his own admission, struggled to use Word and stuff like that. But he was, gaily navigating around through several tabs, ordering stuff from Holland & Barrett, clearing his cache and clearing his website data before then logging off and stuff like that. So, the sort of the tech literacy nous and the activity that was going on varied considerably, I would say.
Great. Guys, that sounds fantastic. I mean, I could feel all of the information and data you've accumulated here. It sounds quite fascinating. I certainly get this feeling of these kind of very isolated usage of libraries, yet there's a yearning for hub and this sense of community. There's something probably an opportunity there, but yeah, I'd be interested to see what you come up with when you come do the affinity mapping. Did you guys, when you saw each other's presentations, did you see the other teams and think, oh, that's good, I wish I'd done that? Is there anything you noticed, think, oh, I wish we'd done that?
I love how they organized their first 4 interviews for library users and the last 4 interviews for possible users. I thought that was a brilliant idea, and that's something I want to stand out about your procedure.
Thank you. Yeah, I liked your breakdown of the contextual inquiries into things you learned and insights, and that was good. It was very nice.
I think what I didn't see, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't see that many pull quotes. And sometimes if you've got quite rational data-driven things like 2 out of 8 people did this, it doesn't always bring it home to a client. It doesn't bring it home. So if you've got that backed up with a little quote, a little pull quote that you have from the transcription, that can just help you to kind of sell it in to that client and say, no, this really was happening and there was some emotions behind this. That's sometimes when you're talking about people at the end of the day, you really want to drill home that this is not just numbers. Numbers are important, but the feeling and the emotion is just as important when we're trying to pass on this knowledge.
And now that I think about it, I think we learned about when we were talking about qualitative and quantitative, that it's nice to put, insights of percentages and stuff, but it's always good to put aside, the qualitative part next to it. So I think. Yeah,
I mean, probably it's probably a little bit early to prioritize, but I think when you go into the affinity mapping, you'll start to figure out what are the prominent kind of themes, and some of the lesser themes you're going to start dropping. And you can imagine if you were to do the presentation again after the affinity mapping, you'd have a much more solidified sense of that information you've accumulated. At the moment, you're probably feeling it's all over the place, it's a bit chaotic, and if you're like me, you're very structured and you like things in spreadsheets, it's very difficult to grasp at this stage. So don't worry, is my point here. Just go with it, and really, you will really find when you do these affinity mapping sessions, when you start to work together and you use the perspectives of the group, you will start to kind of bring it together. You will start to weave it into something that makes sense, and that rigor you get from different people's opinions and different observations really does make it hang better as a kind of a piece of work. So I think you did a great job, guys. It was really nice there. Is there any other comments you've got on the other team's work?
It's very, very well presented. I think the way that they sort of broke it down, the insights versus the findings with different color schemes, that worked really well. And it was a really well put together presentation.
I mean, I thought it is interesting. Both the teams' presentations are quite different ways of doing it, and they weren't wrong at all. They both had pros and cons. But I thought, I'm instinctively thinking, oh, you could take some of that from that and you could weave in some of that. So I think you can start to see how you can kind of learn from each other on some of these tasks. Great, fabulous. Is there anyone else anything else they want to kind of ask me or while I'm online? Is there anything else you want to go on, Christian?
Sort of guerrilla kind of in the field, cutthroat interview kind of. We all felt extremely enervated after doing it. Like it was taxing. I suppose this is what we could probably learn from the other group as well, was that they used other methods of finding relevant participants, but because we wanted to find people on Monday, because for me the library was closed on Sunday. I think for a lot of us the library was empty on Sunday, and we were all just absolutely shattered on Saturday. So coming and bringing all these questions and the ability to go and interview, etc., after last week was not high on our agenda on Saturday. So Monday seemed to be the only logical day to do it, and obviously it was stressful to sort of cram it all in. But yeah, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is the notion of going out and just asking people in the wild like that, do you mind, bloody blah. Is that something that is intrinsic to the field of UX? Do you find yourself doing that a lot, or is it more structured? You've got to kind of, you as you mentioned, you've got screening agencies, and you're able to kind of filter out a bit more effectively.
Yeah. So we do guerrilla testing, and you tend to use it where time's a factor, where you either don't have enough time or you don't have enough budget, being completely honest about the company. And often your frustration as a designer, if you're coming into an organization and they're not set up for user research, you're going to think, well, how do I get this information? And guerrilla testing is a great way to kind of do that. It is hard work though. I mean, I can't stress enough with guerrilla testing, even though the act feels a bit kind of ad hoc, the preparation involved in what you want to get out of it is really important, to structure it and get out of it what you want. The other bit is, obviously, when you're doing more professional testing, you would normally have a screener, and you would have an agency that would do the recruitment for you. Doesn't always happen though, but that, I mean, even though that takes off a lot of the weight off your shoulders, the actual testing itself can be really grueling. You know, you could be stuck in the same room, one participant after another, and I've seen people just collapse on the floor after they've done 8 interviews. You know, it's hard work, it's grueling. But the amount of value you get from speaking to users, hugely valuable. Also, I'd say guerrilla testing is more in line with rapid development, kind of product development. So if you're working in agile teams where there's fast iterative change, so you're producing less documentation, you're doing things based on specific bits of information as you go along, that's where guerrilla testing is really useful, because you can just pop out, go and get some insight, get 5 users, do it over a day, come back. Probably won't even write a report, right? You might even just say bullet points. Here's some the new feature, we've tested this with a few users. Here's what they said, here's what they did, here's how many completed it. That's kind of useful. And it's more, I would say guerrilla testing is more about, in that context, it's more about nudges in the right place. You're not perfectly validating it. It's not up to scientific rigor, but something is better than nothing in this game.
Yeah.
And so having those little nudges to make sure you are focusing not on the business whims and the powerful voices in the organization, and also it's not coming just from you as well. You want to show deliberately, this is not about you as a designer, this is the users that you are representing. You having that as a mechanism, it can be really valuable, but it is hard. And I have to say, you know, throughout my career, I was relieved when I got to a state when I just had to buy a company to do the recruitment for me. It did get to a point where actually I don't want to do this anymore. It is hard, but it is, you know, you're not always in that luxurious position. If you are starting out as a team, UX team as one, and generally the maturity of that company isn't that savvy with UX, you've got to fight to try and get that information in there. And guerrilla testing, and there are lots of other things you can use. Card sorting we'll come to later. That's also another really great mechanism for bringing information into the business around a proposition. All really great kind of methodologies to use. But yeah, it is tough.
Cool, thank you.
Anything else, guys?
I am conscious of people's time, and it's just a really quick question, fairly off topic. I don't know if other people are experiencing this, but there is some form of imposter syndrome, I feel, fairly occasionally. And I just want to know, is that normal, and how do you avoid feeling like that?
It's tough, and I know I suffer with it as well. You know, I think the moment you feel you've got imposter syndrome is when you hold back. And when you feel, you know, you want to contribute, but you're not quite sure what you say, or you don't feel you have enough knowledge to know enough to say anything. And what I would say is, have a little notion in your head. You've got something you want to say. You're all passionate people. You all have got lots of really, really good data there. You know, you've probably got loads of thoughts going through your head. start asking yourself questions. So if you're not ready to say something, maybe that's telling you something that you haven't quite figured out what it is you want to say to everyone else, or how you want to represent that. Ask yourself, is that mechanism called the 5 whys? You can ask yourself, well, why am I feeling this? And then, so why is that the case? And you can start to kind of ask why continuously until you kind of structure your thoughts a little bit more. That can sometimes help you. But also, the other thing I'd say is don't be afraid to make mistakes. Really important characteristic of a UX designer is that you are open enough that you will put things forwards, but change that view very quickly. There's a quote I remember, which is strong opinions loosely held. So you could talk quite with strong opinions, you have a strong emphatic view, but you're willing to be disproved very quickly and take a different tact. If you are able to take up that kind of mantra as a UX designer, you suddenly feel a bit safer about saying things and contributing. If you've come from probably an industry before, where you've been working before, where it's quite literal, it's very binary, it's yes or no, or if you from especially functional services where you've got to have very rigorous data to support everything you do, that notion of failing fast can be quite hard, but it does come to you. It will come to you. But have faith. You're all in the same boat, and I think don't be afraid to make mistakes. There's nothing wrong with having strong opinions, and sometimes that can spur someone else on to think, oh, actually that did happen, or no, I'm going to challenge that, and that can help you in return. So there is so much of UX is a communication style. But it doesn't come overnight. These things develop. So I think just be. I think the thing for you to help others in that context is just be kind and respectful to each other's views. They may be wrong, and you may have passionate views that it is wrong. But think in your head, what can I say to constructively come back and help them move on from their position? It's difficult. It really is difficult. Does that help a little bit?
Definitely, yeah, 100%. Thank you.
Cool. And you will, when you do the affinity mapping sessions, you will come up against that. You will have passionately held views. I saw this. I definitely saw it. It wasn't that over there. And somehow you have to come to a position where you can agree that both things did happen, but they have some similarities. There's something in the intent which is similar. So you try and look at it for a high level lens, and some of those things can be very similar. Cool. Anything else from anyone else? Cool, fantastic. Right, brilliant. I think we're all done, guys. I'm going to put these videos up and put them on Canvas, and I'll put them in the Slack channel as well, so you can see them later. Please set up your one-to-ones for this week if you haven't already. Me or Christina or both, entirely up to you. And I will see you again on Friday. So I'll see you then, guys. Have a great week.
Cheers,
Thanks,
guys.
Graham.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Bye bye.
See ya.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.